All right, we're recording. So let's begin. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you wherever you are, because we are calling in from, I think, almost every corner of the planet, right? From Australia to the Americas. So that's fun. Um, Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Suyi was just saying we have quite a lot of people in the room, which is excellent. And welcome to this panel on Afrocentric Futurisms, where we will mostly be talking about African speculative fiction from multiple angles, but especially focusing on our recent books, which are Convergence Problems, The Year of Return, Womb City, and of course, Lost Ark Dreaming. My name is Wole Talabi. I am an engineer, writer, editor from Nigeria, mostly in that order. Um, and I just kind of want to remind everybody that all of the books I just mentioned and the books we're going to be talking about today are available in all good bookstores around the world, but especially from the Sister Sci-Fi bookstore, where you can also get signed book plates. So if you don't have any of the books, please place an order, grab them, read them. If you've read them already, then this discussion will be even more entertaining for you, I think. And by way of introduction, I will answer one of the questions that just came up in the chat, which is what inspired this event? Asked by Sister Sci-Fi, Isis. So essentially, this event started as an email, which I believe I sent an email to Suyi. I had just read one of Suyi's stories, Rigland, and I was reading Lost Ark Dreaming. And I was noticing a lot of similarities between our work. I'd also done an event with Tlotlo before on Womb City, and I'd also noticed a lot of similarities in our work. And I was like, okay, well, if there's a lot of similarities in our work, then we should talk about it. So that's how that whole email chain started. I emailed Suyi, we pulled in Tlotlo, we pulled in Akotowaa, and we set all this up. So I've introduced myself. I've introduced the panel. I've told you how the panel came to be, but I will now let the other panelists introduce themselves quickly, and then we'll jump into the discussions that you came here for. So please, maybe we'll start with Akotowaa.
Somehow I had a feeling that I would be chosen. But my name is Akotowaa. My legal name is Ivana Akotowaa Ofori, and that's what I publish under. I'm a writer and an editor, and The Year of Return is my debut novella. I'm also Ghanaian and based in Ghana at the moment. So yeah, that is me.
Cool. And Tlotlo, you want to go next? Oh, can't hear you. Nope.
No, I don't. We can't hear you either. Yet as
Yeah.
well.
Technical difficulty. Okay. Suyi, you can introduce yourself while we sort that out.
Hello, everybody. I'm Suyi Davies Okungbowa. I am an author of multiple books, most probably known to you as the author of David Mogul Godhunter, which was my debut novel, or the Nameless Republic epic fantasy series, starting with Son of the Storm and most recently Warrior of the Wind, or my most recent work, which is the novella Lost Ark Dreaming, which was published by Tordotcom, who is hosting us this evening. So my very excellent publicist, Sarisia, is here in the background. I have written these books as well as multiple short stories, essays, etc. Currently, I live in Ottawa, in Ontario, in Canada, where I am a professor of creative writing and English literature at the University of Ottawa. That's pretty much it about me.
All right. Okay, and I think we can go to Tlotlo now.
Still muted. I suspect you probably need to change your audio
Or
input.
change your headset,
Yeah.
maybe. It's probably that.
Can everyone hear me now?
Now we can hear you. That's excellent. Yes.
Right. Thank you for that, for your patience, and it's lovely to meet everyone. I am Tlotlo Tsamaase. I am a short story writer, and Womb City is my debut adult novel. I have a couple of short stories published in literary magazines and anthologies as well. Right, that's it. Thank you.
All right. Perfect. So let's jump right into the discussion. We'll start broad and then narrow things down into a few more specifics and then talk about our books and so on. But I'd like to begin with, African speculative fiction itself, which for the purpose of this discussion, we're kind of using the broader term Afrocentric Futurisms, which encompasses both African speculative fiction by people connected to the continent in general, using the broadest possible term here. And because of that, it is a very varied term. It encompasses a lot of different works. And in fact, sometimes I like to joke that essentially there's no unifying elements except that the people that wrote the works are connected to the African continent. However, I like to think there are commonalities. So as a general question to the panel, what are some of the recurring themes or ideas or concepts that you see in Afrocentric futurisms generally, in your own work or in the work of others that you're reading, that you find interesting, that you see threaded across multiple different kinds of stories? And I guess I'll start with Suyi.
I mean, that's a good question. It's one that I'm still trying to answer every day, each day. And I guess for me, what I tend to think of when I think of what the unifying parameter is, I think is I'm thinking of works that's, as it said, like Afrocentric in the sense that they center the concerns or the thinking or the things that of immediate importance, to I'd say the African self in that specific situation, or where that thought for the story or the narrative is coming out from. I think it's that centering. I think that tends to be the unifying factor. So, you talked about all our works and they all take place in different places, but what they tend to do is to center the people that are centered, the ideas that are centered, the things that are that are highlighted, things that are front and center from those stories, regardless of where they are set, are highlighting and centering and focusing on the concerns of the African self, regardless of what iteration of the African self is being present at that time in the story. The characters or the authors, framing of the story or framing of the ideas, etc. So I like to think of that as like the ground zero, right? point where everything sort of bursts out from. Then it then goes into different directions of what kinds of concerns, social, political, gender concerns, economic concerns, etc., stuff like that, technological concerns. But that's what keeps it rooted in that way, that say works that do not do that are then often separate in that sense. You can tell, okay, this work isn't centering the African self in that way. And then apart from like just the African self, right, in the much broader terms, right, it's thinking of like the other iterations of the African self, even in a fantastic sense, right, or even in the sense of the self that is removed from this very space of the continent by time and space, historically, heritage-wise, etc. But it's still doing, like, at the center, it's doing that work. It's turning the camera and saying, "I am focusing on your concerns," right? So I like to think of it that way, and I think for me, that's my like ground zero when I'm thinking of these works in a broader sense.
Yeah, now that's definitely a good answer. And I mean, I guess that's why it's Afrocentric Futurisms, because, center. Akotowaa, do you want to jump in?
Yes. I think to answer the question of like, what are some of the common trends that I'm seeing, I think that I'm seeing a lot of African superstitions, inspiring a lot of Afrocentric futurisms in a way that is kind of specific to the like locality of where the writer is writing from, or which culture they identify with. Like for example, in Tordotcom's Africa Risen, this Nigerian writer Adanadi has this story about flying downforce, right? And like the idea of flying cars is already a futurism, but then you make the car a downfall, and suddenly it's like, oh, I know exactly where this is from. So I'm noticing that, I think there was the Juju Stories film as well, where like they played on the concept of a person turning into a yam when they pick up money, which is like something that I grew up hearing like all the time. And yeah, so I feel like African superstitions are playing a very big role, but I also think I'm seeing a trend of indigenous African religion and mythologies. Especially I think Suyi Davies' work, like it started, well, it didn't start, but then there was a sort of explosion that happened when David Mogo came onto the scene. And I feel like we are seeing more of that, like Shigidi features in Wole Talabi's like most recent novel. I feel like that's another trend that I'm seeing a lot and really liking.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say also, I tell my wife the whole yam thing all the time, because sometimes she tries to pick money from the ground and I'm like, stop that. We're not doing that here. I don't want a yam in my house. You will not be yam. Okay. Anyway, let's go.
Right. I agree with what Suyi and Akotowaa said. And to add on to that, another common thing that I find is the way that we turn our lived experiences and execute it on the narrative, whether it's racism you're facing or sexism you're facing or gender-based violence that you're facing. And what I find interesting is the way that they take these ideas and execute them in their own writing style. Another interesting thing is also the way that we weave in our own myths, like from our own culture. You can see how people from like different parts of Africa actually weave in folk tales and mythologies. a book that I can remember. It's written by Cheryl and Thuni. I don't know if it's still available or if it's out of print, but it was a YA trilogy, and I cannot remember the title, but it was set in Botswana, and it featured this young character who had a father as a traditional healer. And there's so much misconception when it comes to like traditional healers and sangomas and witch doctors. So it was very fascinating to see a young Botswana character who has this grandfather who has these gifts. And even the character themselves, they had this gift, you know, and was really expressed in a very nuanced way. So seeing that commonality within so many other different African authors, and basically also how we detail the atrocities that happen to our continent, that happen to our countries, that happen to our families. There's that common thread, you know, and often you will find out that our lived experience are also seen as like entertainment and in terms of like horror, which is incredible. But yeah, thank you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I really like thinking about this. I think I gave a panel presentation at last year's Worldcon in Chengdu, where I tried to find a few points, some of which you guys have already touched on, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it again. I think one of the interesting trends I find, like especially more and more, is that seamless incorporation of what is generally termed the supernatural and the natural occurring together, right? You find this in even older works of African speculative fiction, going back to like Kojo Lang's work from the 1980s, you know, including futuristic elements with elements that may be considered fantasy by, you know, Western genre labeling. But, you know, these things are presented side by side and there is no distinction, there's no separation. It just is what it is. Another thing I find really interesting as well is a lot of Afrocentric futurisms tend to use non-traditional story narratives. And that's something we're going to talk about later. You tend to find a lot of non-linear timelines. You tend to find what I call event-based storytelling rather than time-based storytelling. So the story is structured in whatever way is needed to provide the most impact for the event, right? And I think this is something that has roots in like oral tradition. There is usually no problem with having meta-fictional elements in the story. It doesn't throw people off. Those are some of the elements I'm finding, not in every story, but in enough of them for me to take notice, right? And that's something I find really interesting. We'll talk a bit more about that later because I think all our works have some element of that as well. So, you know, I'm noticing the thing while I'm also doing the thing, which is always interesting. All right. So I guess that brings me quite well to my next question, kind of our jumping off discussion point. A lot of African, well, I'll say Afrocentric futurisms tends not to be bothered too much by the specifics of genre. And in fact, we just seem to just like to tell stories. Whatever form the story takes is the way you get the story, right? Anything you see, you take it like that, as we like to say in Nigeria. So what do you guys think about that? And do you think of genre specifically when you're writing your own work? And feel free to talk specifically about the books we are focusing on today. So I'll start in reverse order and we can start with you, Tlotlo. Because I also think you have some of the messiest genre blending in Home City that I've seen in a while, and I love it. So please.
Wow, thank you so much. What's actually interesting is that I started out in sci-fi, and this was probably due to my architectural background because at that time, I was still studying architecture and I was very fascinated at the way that buildings are designed and they're developed from someone says hi from South Africa, hello. And I was very fascinated at all that entails in basically coming up with an idea and then developing it into a feasible building that people could live in. And I was very interested in trying to do that with human beings. And I think my earlier stories were very strictly sci-fi. I think that was like Eco-Humans or something. But then over time, as I was writing, coming toward like my novella, I was very interested in our folklores, and actually writing a story that was based off some of like the myths that we had. And I mean, like you said earlier on about the supernatural and natural and how sometimes our stories are considered like fantasy or speculative fiction. To us in our own culture, it really doesn't feel like that. It is part of our reality. And so I came up with the story idea that was based around a myth that was circulating back at home about how if diseased people who are on a train are trying to call you onto the train, you're going to end up dead. And I was very terrified as a kid hearing that, because how do you control your dream sense? And in a way, we are very superstitious. So it was then when I actually ended up putting my myths and folklores from like my own culture that I found out that I was categorized under speculative fiction. And I was like, oh, okay, what is this? And so having written from like different genres, you know, you can consider like one genre as like this sort of like fortress. And there are certain things that you can't do in that genre that are really not feasible or compatible with genre, for example, sci-fi. And I noticed that there are certain things that you can do that fit with like speculative fiction. And speculative fiction felt more fitting for my identity and from where I come from as a Motswana writer. But then I don't know when I started actually exploring like blending genres. I realized that if you say, for example, you have an idea and you explore it through the sci-fi lens, the minute that you bring another genre, it's like it's an open door. It feels like it's a house. Like you have this house and each room is like a different genre and they're connected by doors. And in that way, you're able to, it's able to help with like plot lines or issues or plot holes that you're finding in the story. So I would feel boxed in with one genre, and the minute that I step into like speculative fiction, I feel like, okay, this world is expanding a little bit, and it's able to fit more of my cultural background. I feel like I may have digressed a bit from that question, but yeah, that's the idea about blending genres. I feel that some genres can feel a little bit closed off to the stories that we tell back at home, because how you're supposed to fit them in a science fiction field or dystopian field, etc. Thank you.
No, I don't think you digressed at all. I think that's a really good answer, because genres are kind of emergent properties of stories, right? People just told stories, and then in the analysis and in the understanding of them, we came up with all these genres. And then there's kind of a backporting of genre onto storytelling. So people telling new stories try to now fit into these boxes that have been circumscribed around previous literature, but actually the boxes didn't exist in original storytelling, right? And I feel like you went on that journey yourself of starting with, you know, I'm trying to be in this box and then realizing the limits of storytelling are broader, right? So no, that's a really good answer, and kind of illustrates, I think, a lot of our experiences. Suyi, you want to jump in?
Sure, I really love what you're saying, Tlotlo, because like it felt very similar to me in that manner. I would like to say, as you said, Wole, that genre as we understand it now, right? That as we go to a bookstore and we look at the shelf and it says this, is an impression upon the story. It's not the other way around. The story exists irrespective of what genre label you impress upon it. And what tends to happen, of course, because we have publishing, we have industry, we have institutions that impress these things, right? Libraries have to stock your books somewhere. Because of that, we tend to think, therefore, within these spaces and say, well, what am I writing? Is it going to go on the science fiction shelf? But I don't think all stories really adhere to these things. Stories can be something, need to be something beyond that. and I had this, right? I mean, Lost Ark Dreaming is a good example of a story that people are always asking me what it is, or I see readers describe it as different things. People will be like, oh, is it locked room horror, or is it science fiction, or is it fantasy? And the truth is, when I was thinking about some of these things, I wasn't even thinking, I forced myself to not think like that. I was saying, what are the concerns of this story, regardless of what form they take? And sometimes there are multiple explanations for the same things, right? People are asking me, are these elements fantastic? Or are they science fictional in a way that requires a lot of, evolution, for instance, or which does happen in real life, right? So what I'm like, but that's not the point, because it doesn't matter. The part that matters is that that's how it manifests, right? These things manifest in this way. You could literally, as they say, every something that could be scientifically discombobulating can be have a fantastic explanation. Black holes. I remember watching this planetarium show on black holes, and I was like, that is a fantastic. Black holes feel like fantastic elements just because of the kinds of things they can do, how they can stretch time, stretch space. If you experienced a black hole and lived to tell the tale, you would come out of that feeling like it's a very fantastic experience. But if you ask a regular person, they'll be like, that sounds like science fiction to me. And so I like to think about the idea that even things that we don't have particular explanations for, that we still tend to think within the realm of science fiction, in the tapestry of fictional realities, right? From one end, we have like the realist primary world, and then we have pretty much a varied way in which our reality can exist. Some things have explanations, and we adhere to them. Some don't, but we believe in them anyway. I mean, literally ask any, people who have religious beliefs, for instance, in the world. There doesn't need to be an explanation for something, but for that belief to exist. The belief exists anyway, and because the belief exists, therefore the reality of it exists, right? So I guess I'm saying, like, it sort of steps outside of those bounds after a while. If you think beyond the fact that just wanting to impress fantasy or science fiction or horror or something upon something is, as you say, after the fact. In the experience of the thing, in the creation of the thing, it is what it is, if I should put it that way. And I think this is how a lot of the stories exist, right? This is how historically the stories, especially kinds of stories that I grew up with, where I come from, they exist in that manner. They don't adhere to these labels because they don't think about these labels. They think about what the story itself needs to be, what the reality of that telling needs to be, and then the labels come after. And so I sort of switching my frame of mind allowed me to think in that manner as well, and then therefore create in that manner.
I think a lot of us have experienced this switch. It sounds so familiar. Akotowaa, do you have thoughts on genre?
Yeah, first of all, yes to everything Tlotlo said about how Africans conceive, because I definitely feel like I've written some things that have like strange elements that Africans may not necessarily consider as speculative fiction, because that's just life. Like, yes, there are witches flying around Tsamaase at night because that's just what they do. And it's very interesting because I remember about maybe 10 years ago when I kind of started putting out strange stories on my blog or wherever, and being told that this is not the stuff that Africans or Ghanaians are supposed to write. And you ask why, and then they're like, because of the political climate, you're supposed to be, and I mean, despite all of the speculative elements in the OG African writers, you have Benokri, you have Kujole, you have Ngui Wationgo, you have Amos Tutola, but then politics is what African writers write. I don't know what happened. Probably Black Panther happened, but there was just this very interesting. I don't know if I should call it cognitive dissonance or something along those lines, but it's just like there are all of these stories and tales from like real life. Like, somebody's auntie says that they were cursed by, a fetish priest or their sister or, whatever. And people just like take these and run with them. And then you put those into stories and then it's just like, but this is not realistic. And I don't know why. But I definitely feel like things have shifted dramatically since Black Panther came out. And also yes to everything Suyi said about marketing, because truly, honestly, I was just writing a story that came to me. And then I've never considered myself a horror writer, like ever. I like if you ask me like what genres do I write, I would not put horror in on the list. I don't even, most of the time I don't even categorize my writing. And I was shocked to see that my novella is being like marketed under horror. I'm like, oh, really? Okay, I didn't know that. I'm definitely also one of those people that I don't think I think too much about genre before I write. I'm not sure why so much of what I've written recently has fallen under the category of speculative fiction, but I think maybe 5 years ago, I had no idea what that was. I didn't know that this was a label. I was familiar with speculative fiction works because I've consumed more of, well, no, I read in a variety of genres, but I've consumed so much of it, and ever since discovering Nidi Okorafor, like so much of it from people of African descent. And I didn't know that there was a term or multiple terms for these things until like 2019. So I don't know. I also think that I think because of capitalism, there is like a pressure kind of when you produce one thing, it's like, oh, can we expect more of this from you? And so can we like I want to form an alliance with you as a publisher or as a whatever, so that you can keep like delivering the same sort of thing. But then I really do want to subscribe to that idea of just the artist's freedom. I feel like Africans should just write what they want to write. And because of our lived experiences, some of those things are just going to come out in genres that are classified as certain ways. And I think that that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
those are my thoughts.
yeah. No, and those are great thoughts. And I was going to say, I think for me, especially for everyone listening on this panel, be prepared when you read African speculative fiction to be surprised. I think you will find we've all had different journeys at arriving at genre. And, I think depending on the storytelling tradition you come from, most of us have a blend of origins, exposure to Western storytelling structures, but also traditional African storytelling structures. And that eventually reflects in our work, no matter how we arrive at that point. You will probably get a blend of things. So be prepared to be surprised. And I think it will probably be more entertaining as well. At least it's more interesting, I find. Okay, so we are going to do a few quick readings because we've been talking a bit about our work, but I think we can give you samples. So just 2-minute samples, very quickly, just read from 2 works. So maybe we'll start with Tlotlo and Akotowaa first. Tlotlo, you can pick a quick 2-minute segment from Womb City, and Akotowaa, you can get ready. And once Tlotlo is done, you just jump right in. So we'll have a few quick readings.
Right. I'll just start off in the middle of Womb City. What's is the middle? On the ground she lies. I see her. The pain licks at the jarring bone protruding from her elbow, a piece of white beauty sticking out, sharp as a sword. John kneels next to me. His hands are around my face, the blood, the pain. Are you okay? Did you get hurt? Nothing sobers you like a murder. My microchip records my every waking moment. It's supposed to respond to a person's intent and actions, whether I intend to commit murder or end up in an accident. My microchip is supposed to stop me, either by electric shock or by taking control of my motor neurons and alerting the police monitoring towers, triggering my drone and the authorities to locate me. I tap my wrist, checking the functionality of my microchip on a projected hologram. Microchip outages are rare, but they do happen. But mine doesn't show any diagnostic errors or failure. If no alert is transmitted from it to the police towers, the government will assume nothing of note is occurring. In a panic, I stare at the car's console where the remote control lies. Its LED light blinks blue, meaning it's been intercepting my microchip the whole time, meaning this accident hasn't gotten flagged, meaning I am free for now. I take a deep breath, relieved. God, so I can trust John. She's still alive. John, call the police and ambulance, I say. I kneel, touch her hair like a fractured egg. Oh my God, sweetie, we'll get help. Hang on, okay? You'll be okay. We're going to get you out of here, okay? Her eyes reel to the side. She gargles blood instead of words. Help, she manages, raising her hand to my face, smearing it with blood. Her nails scrape my neck before falling back to her side. A twig snaps. I look up. John, doing nothing, just standing there, a dangerous panic in his eyes. What are we going to tell them? His eyes are listless, and I stand up to make him concentrate, to make sense. She touched you. Your fingerprints are all over her. He continues. Your DNA is beneath her nails. Your tire marks are on her face. I step back, fear collapsing into my lungs. We're high and intoxicated, pumped with drugs, caught in a negligent accident. What's she going to tell them? No, fuck, what's she doing in the middle of nowhere late at night? Breaths chug out from my chest. I attempt to touch him, but I'm too afraid. John, she's still alive. The girl struggles to say something, words blanched with spurts of blood. I won't say anything. Something protrudes from her chest, a chunk of metal, winking back the lights from the car. A grisly image, biblical undertones, but priapic insinuation. Fingers gnawed, I step forward, something cushy beneath my foot. It's her thumb, the soft tissue gorged, the tail lights of lurid red on her body, her small body, her thin fingers, the light in her brown eyes, her braids caught in the spinning wheel, peeled off her scalp, her braids, her skin, the layer folded back like the peel of a fruit. Jesus, what a painful way to die. I turn, vomit again. She loose designer denim boots, parka jacket, braids running down like a rope for strangulation. My first reaction, I reach for my phone. Stop. We're high and drunk, John repeats. We're over the limit. This is no slap on the wrist. We'll be virtually incarcerated. We'll never have a chance of getting transferred into another body. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to read from the second chapter of The Year of Return. With all three friends in tow, I pulled up to Old Accra, somewhere off to the side of High Street, and the minute I opened my car door, we were assaulted by noise. It seemed like every church in the neighborhood was holding service at once. Two preachers vied for attention on the same street where I'd parked. They had somehow transported their sound system equipment outside and were screaming into their microphones, switching between Ga and speaking in tongues. I was sure I caught at least one English phrase, "Come against the spirits of the devil," within the cascade of words. The preachers had attracted small crowds of people who listened to them intensely, waving their handkerchiefs and muttering fervent amens. One by one, my friends and I stepped out of my car and I led the way towards the beach. There were no boats on the water today, but there were far too many people around for a Christmas morning, especially since the beach just outside Usher Fort wasn't exactly designed for leisure tourism. Many of those milling around were children, some scruffy, others in church clothes. They'd probably ditched their praying parents on the streets or escaped Sunday school. In any case, I was sure everyone here had come for the same reason. Looks like the coast is clear, Charlene joked. Only Randy laughed. My muscles had been tense from the moment we'd arrived, and the current absence of coasters wasn't enough to set me at ease. Give it a minute, Onisha countered. I decided to be brave. I moved forward, closer to the water, passing clusters of people whispering tersely amongst themselves and casting furtive glances towards the sea. They let me through, too apprehensive to get too close themselves. Hey! Hey, Kwemo, hey! The child's screams set off an avalanche of panic, making Randy jump, but the coaster hadn't needed the oral announcement. The supernatural chill was enough to catch our attention. Others began to scream and run away from the beach or otherwise back away in terror amidst muttered prayers. 6 more coasters joined the first, rising out of the sea, their ghostly bodies appearing to form out of darkening ocean mist. I understood now that the haziness I thought I'd seen in all the Twitter videos wasn't haze, it was translucence. The bodies of the coasters really were more gaseous than solid. But as frightening as their physical presence was, the real terror came from the way they troubled the atmosphere itself, permeating everything with a darkness that clawed its way into one's soul. I forced myself to stay still, though my heartbeat was hammering in my ears. With Charlene to my left and Onisha and Randy to my right, we all had a clear view of the spectacle. I cleared my throat, pouring the rest of my willpower into trying not to sound like I'd inhaled from a helium balloon. Onisha, I called. Yeah? Her breaths were a bit too deep, but she seemed to be holding up well. Can you read their auras? She squinted towards the horizon. It's hard to do that with all the energy from the people around us. The best I can get right now is the color of their presence. The color of their presence, Charlene repeated flatly. And what does that feel like? I pressed Onisha. It doesn't feel like life, but it doesn't feel like death either. It's something incomplete. Ghosts, I thought. A shiver worked its way down my spine, amplifying the icy fear I was already trying to ignore. These are the ghosts of slaves returned to haunt us for our betrayal. We should have burned all the castles and forts down to the ground. We should have offered sacrifices to every god and god out there and begged to be absolved for our forefathers' sins. We are all going to hell. I paused. No, that's not right, I thought. Hell is coming to us.
Excellent. Those were excellent readings. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk specifically about 2 or 3 works. So in a lot of our futuristic African societies, especially in Lost Ark Dreaming, and also in a lot of my stories in Convergence Problems, which I did not mention, is a collection of stories centered around one central novella called Ganger. But in both Lost Ark Dreaming and in Ganger, there are class divisions, right? And these stories primarily take place in super city structures that are meant to be refugees. They're meant to be some kinds of refuge from the impacts of climate change that end up with very stratified social structures that people attempt to break out from. And I found it really fascinating. This was one of the things that inspired this entire panel, was that we had both written these 2 novellas touching on the same topics, very different in tone, but essentially touching on the ideas of climate change, of class structure, of super cities, of billionaires, tech billionaires building something as some kind of escape from climate change. I found that really fascinating, and I wanted to use it as a way of talking about what inspired you specifically, Suyi, in writing Lost Ark Dreaming, and just to see where that kind of maps onto my own thoughts as well. So do you want to tell us about the roots of the class structure, the mega structure, and the ideas of exploring climate and environmental survival in Lost Ark Dreaming?
Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, so Lost Ark Dreaming is really multiple threads, right, coming together. I'm pretty sure when we get to the point where we talk a bit about, you see where some of the stuff, especially when I read my excerpt, you see how it maps onto something very similar to what Akotowaa has read. But I will say, if I was to speak specifically of the the inspirations in those aspects. The first is that, well, I lived and worked in Lagos for quite a while, and the office I was working on was literally on the coastline. So I could, I'd literally, it was built on the coastline even. So I would see everything. I worked on like the 13th floor or something, and I'd see like literally that coastline. I'd drive past the coastline every day to go to work. So I could see some of the actual visual stuff happening. I could see the towers that were being built, the towers around which Lost Ark remain, the fictionalized towers in what Lost Ark remain are actually inspired by real towers in Lagos that have been built. Maybe not to the same degree, but they exist, right? Towers like these exist. But it was, first of all, witnessing that, but also having a very acute sense of what it looked like on the ground. I always say, like, I know we say climate change and environmental changes are actually people, but like I think they are socioeconomical issues in the sense that they actually reinforce. A lot of the changes we're seeing climate-wise reinforce the kinds of divisions that we have, economic and socioeconomic divisions that we already have. They will only exacerbate what exists. And if you've lived in any, African megacity, these are very stark. The different, the privileges, access, different kind of like ways of living just because of the socioeconomic level you're on are very stark. They're not even, one of the things I always say about Canada, like living in Canada, is like Canadians are very quiet about most things, even if the things like right in front of them, to vocalize it is not very much a cultural thing. It's the complete opposite. Like living in Lagos, people would literally say, "Hey, I am rich." They would say it. It's a thing that they say because they are living the life of a rich person, and they are only able to afford living that way because they can continue to manifest that privilege upon the space. In that way, therefore, when we think of climate change, it's going to manifest in the same way. People who have the access, who have the privilege, who have the wherewithal to live a certain way will continue to do so visibly. So the towers make sense. Therefore, if I had money and I saw literally the sea cutting into land every 2 years, I would say, well, maybe it's time for me to start thinking about my future. We hear a lot of people, some billionaires in the Americas building like bunkers, right? That's them doing the same thing. They're just doing it underground in the other direction. So I was thinking about that. Like if you knew that literally the land on which you live is screwed, you would try to find a solution for yourself and people like you. That's what the towers I felt were doing. So that's how the class, and then of course the class structure is not just going to be left on land. It's going to be carried over into this new space and mapped onto the new space. And so I guess the question I was asking myself was, well, how will that socioeconomic strata be mapped on this new living space, even if this living space is just a tower, right? So that's really how that socioeconomic aspect came from. But it's not, the point I was trying to make is that it's not separate from the environmental factors, right? If there's a flood in Victoria Island, which happened a lot while I was there, how do people get around? It's the people who don't have any other way to get around that have to wade in the water, that the ones that actually get, they wade in the water and then there's a strong current, they get pulled, and then they, no one finds them anymore. They're the ones that actually suffer those. It's people who only have motorcycles or only have bicycles that will, try to make their way and actually come to some sort of issue. Those who can afford to do something else, who can afford to take a ferry, who can afford to ride in a very massive car that doesn't have the same, that can navigate the floods differently, they will continue to do so. They'll continue to find new ways to, exist in this space. So yeah, I was thinking about that, and then thinking about, of course, just like the like worsening conditions of like the Lagos, the city itself. I've been thinking about this a lot. You could see it in David Mogo. It just manifested itself differently in Lost Ark Germain. I am always thinking about that because I live there, and I think along the West African coastline in general, from all the way from Lagos to Abidjan, it's the same thing. Every city that's on that coastline is seeing the same kind of incursion of the Atlantic Ocean. To that end, I was also thinking about the incursion of the Atlantic Ocean or the Atlantic coastline on the west of Africa as a historical site of violence, because this is not the first time that this violence is being visited upon this land and water. it is just one more iteration of that. So I was thinking of the historicity of that. This, therefore, is why trying to make this a very specific narrative of just science fictional towers and environmental change was difficult, because I was like, but this is not the only violence that's been visited. This is a continuous manifestation of violence on these waters and these lands. How have they been repeated? How are these overtones showing themselves again? How is history being manifested over and over and over? And so I had to think beyond that. I had to start thinking about different ways. And one of those ways, of course, if you're very familiar with the transatlantic slave trade, is pretty much that, right? And so it will be impossible to talk about water and the West African coast without talking about that, without talking about gentrification decisions being made by the governments of Lagos and cities like that, where they tear down waterside communities and try to build luxury buildings in their place. All of these things are repetitions, right? In that way. So yeah, I started, as Wole says, right? I stopped thinking about time. I started thinking about event, as you say. It's like an event horizon that spreads across multiple moments in time, and it's just impossible to contain in one specific genre. So that's how all of this came together for me, if this makes sense.
Oh yeah, no, it's fascinating listening to you talk about this, because I also lived in Lagos, and I think that's where the roots of a lot of my thinking about the impacts of climate change also came from. But I guess one of the distinctions for mine, well, before distinctions, I also mentioned an interesting similarity, because in the towers, your class stratification is kind of, you have the uppers, the midders, and the lowers. And in my novella in Ganga, the different parts of the city that are differentiated by class are literally called Isale and Loke, which if you're familiar with Yoruba, literally means above and below, right? It's basically uppers and lowers as well. But one of the interesting things that's maybe different about our approaches, I think we have a lot of the same roots in where our ideas came from. One difference is I'm a practicing engineer, and I work, part of my work overlaps with climate mitigation technology. So CO2 storage, hydrogen production. This is something I've been involved in a lot. It's ramping up more and more recently. But I'm also very aware of the fact that climate change is not really a technology problem. And I say that as an engineer involved in climate mitigation technologies. It is, as Suyi said, it's a socioeconomic problem. It is rooted primarily in overconsumption, in an imbalance in the way we exist in the world, in our own ways of inefficiency in distributing and managing resources and resource consumption. And I've seen, again, thinking event-based, there have been multiple cases where we have come up with a so-called climate mitigation solution that ends up becoming a problem in itself. I won't go into the details of it, but really look up the history of plastics, right? We talk about microplastic being an environmental issue. Plastics were primarily invented, or at least plastics and high-density polymers, where one of the drivers behind the inspiration was to actually reduce the damage on the environment by limiting the amount of destruction we visited on forests and animals, because we're making everything with wood and ivory. So we wanted some artificial product that we could use to also make solid wood, solid items and things like that. And now we've turned that into another problem. So in Ganga and in some of the other stories in Convergence Problems as well, I was really trying to illustrate this. So the social structure kind of manifests as a result of wrong thinking, right? The person that built the city thought she was building a solution to climate change to protect people from the impacts of climate change. But then she just brings on all the wrong thinking from the modern world, including class divisions, overconsumption, thinking of control and maintaining power as opposed to thinking of community. And I wanted to illustrate all of that. So it kind of starts off looking the city in this superstructure. It's a dome situated in like Jos in Nigeria, on the Jos Plateau. And I kind of just wanted to illustrate that, it might seem, when we're thinking about technological solutions to climate change, it might seem like we're coming up with potential utopias, but actually without changing the mindset, the sociocultural framework, we're probably just going to end up with another bad situation that requires fixing as well. So yeah, it's interesting to talk about that. I think now is probably a great time to hear you read, Suyi from Lost Ark Dreaming. So please jump in.
Sure. I will try as much as possible to be brief. So I will just read a very brief section from the. So for those who know or don't know, Lost Ark Dreaming is told in a variety of ways, including interstitial, fictional found documents that are part of different kinds of archives. This actually is one of the entries that comes from an archive that is not on the tower, because the tower thinks they have the only archive of history of everyone who survived the floods. But then the main characters are surprised to find out that there are other ways of storing knowledge, and they gain access to one of them, or they're given access to one of them, and this is one of the entries, right? So this entry is titled Recollection, or upon placing the queen conch to skin and to tongue. The ritual of recollection starts with a roiling in the belly, a hankering, a gathering of desire, faces stricken, bubbles of anxiety, sweat salt on lips licked, fins tucked, belts cinched, offspring gripped tightly. This is the waiting before the coming. The drums begin to talk. Palms smack stretched drum skin, smacks our ear pits. The heralds, those who have long held the tales of our forebears so they may never be lost, open their lips, and our histories wash over us. The heralds call, and the responses come to us, and we know. This is our forebears in one body, singing. Here come the departed, a shoal of ghosts, parting the waters like sword. Here comes the swish of robes that once belonged to spirits that now lie beneath. The combs that once held their hairs aback. This is our forebears in one body, dancing. What is the weight of grief, passed from body to body, a wound shuttled across time and skin? What is the weight of a sore that festers for generations? This and many other questions prowl the dreams of the heralds. How did you become so fragile, you? How did you become unable to bear this weight on behalf of your people, to pass on what is needed, to hold in the stories of their existence, without which they will succumb to a slow death? Do you not come forth from God? Beneath this gill and fin and scale, this seaweed ensnaring your limb, this glare of the oversea sun in your eye, are you not, under that skin, divine? Were you not once a conduit between the seen and not seen, existing on a line and a line alone? Were you not once both touched and untouchable? Were you not once the world? These questions prowl and prowl, seeking answers. When the answer comes, it is quiet and uncluttered. The weight of grief is not a weight for bodies. And so it is spoken and agreed. The tales of the children must be tucked into the queen conch. If a body wishes to be reminded, the queen conch may be retrieved and will freely reveal her secrets to eyes that fear not to see, ears that listen willingly, tongues that speak no violence, nostrils that parse before inhaling, digits that crave connection, and a heart that holds no prejudice. Never again will these burdens be placed on an unwilling body. Now, a body must choose for itself if it will bear this weight of memory and understanding. Thank you.
That was excellent. That was great. Thanks, Suyi. Okay, so let's take a few questions from the audience. In the interest of time, because we had a few technical difficulties at the beginning, I will ask the questions maybe to two people at a time. So we split the load, right? Instead of all four. So first question, I will direct this at Tlotlo and Suyi. What stories first inspired you towards Afrocentric futurisms? Or just your own early inspirations? Tlotlo, you want to go first?
It takes me a long time to actually pin it down. I remember when I was a student in undergrad studies, and at that time I was looking for stories that were authored by Africans, but within the science fiction or magical realism. Because at that time, I had come across Helen Oyemi and Haruki like his earlier works, which were considered magical realism. But I was looking for African authors from Southern Africa who are writing these stories so that I can see how someone who comes from where I am is able to put our identity on the page and basically even see sci-fi stories that are set within Southern Africa, because this was around 2011. It was a long time ago. The world was completely different. And the only author I could come across was Lauren Bucas. She is a South African author, and I came across her two books, Maxiland and Zoo City, I believe. Cyberpunk stood in Joburg, and I can't remember which other South African city. But I was very, very fascinated by the complexity of it. So that's the earlier one that I could honestly remember. And of course, there was Sharon Dumi. She's Ghanaian, but she was also based in Botswana for quite a long time. And so she set most of her stories like in South Africa and Botswana. Yeah, those were the earlier books. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, I love Lauren as well. See?
I think it came out of a natural tendency to want to inculcate the stories I learned growing up, heard, read, watched on TV. So I like to say it's a combination of three things. The first is while I grew up, like my parents are academics, right? So there was books, always books, and these books typically cut across the spectrum. Some of them had speculative elements. They were all from, but not a lot of them, not as many of them were Afrocentric and also with speculative elements, right? Most of them that tended to have speculative elements, fantasy, science fiction, would be often from Europe or Britain or the US, pretty much. So I pretty much read some of those, the authors. I didn't even read a lot of what people consider like the formative authors, etc. I didn't read any Asimov or Tolkien or whatever. But what ended up happening was that I read just a bunch of stories, right? And I knew that fantasy and science fiction existed, if I should put it that way. But then here's the other thing. I grew up in the world of Nollywood, and everyone who knows what Nollywood is like, Nigerian cinema is very particular in the way it presents its stories. And in the time I grew up in the 90s, there was a lot of stories that had very strong speculative elements top to bottom. It's funny because now I'm saying this because at the time they were not seeing that speculative element. They were realist elements. They still are realist elements in the sense that people watch them and say, yeah, that happens. Even if on the scale of fictional realities would file that pretty much under like speculative. But as I always like to say, I think of them now more within the realm of surrealist and or realist work, in the sense that people think of them as part and parcel of the everyday world, right? So when you take I took that Nollywood, I took these, and then I like to say the third thing is sort of gossip, if I should use that term, in that you listen to stories people tell you. I say gossip now because it's not like we sat around the fire. Really what happens is that you're listening on people talking. And again, a lot of the stories had very strong speculative elements to them. They will tell you, the other day we saw somebody flying. It's just a thing they say. And sure, there's going to be people that are going to be like, haha, good joke. And there are people who will be like, take that very seriously. And they're on the spectrum, but I walked away from those stories understanding that this was a thing that happened. This was a thing that exists in the world. And so I guess the natural tendency, therefore, for the stories I wanted to tell will come from those. If I wanted to root those spaces, stories in those spaces, it makes no sense to have those stories and not have those other stories as part and parcel, or that thinking as part and parcel of the storytelling. It's just this, and I think this is why if you see a lot of the Afrocentric Futurisms, even when they have very strong technological structures, right, in terms of or they have strong technological overtones in them, they that never exists on its own individually. There's always some mixed in with some other way of thinking about the world. Some of them philosophical, some of them we deem spiritual, some of them we deem fantastic, but they always coexist because they coexist now. You know, you could have a driving test. I always say, like, you could have a self-driving Tesla in Lagos, like plying the streets, and at the same time someone still thinks people fly at night. And those two, it doesn't exist as cognitive dissonance. That is the firm understanding of the world, and that's the way it functions. I don't think that's going to change in 100 years. So if you had a futuristic city and no one was still thinking like that, that will be suspect to me. So that's how I think about when I tell the stories. I'm like, it's impossible to not have these things coexist. So, you know, in David Mogo, on one hand, I'm talking about, you know, the gods of the deities from the Yoruba pantheon living side by side, side by side with like humans, right? But it doesn't stop someone from getting on a public bus and preaching about the second coming of Jesus Christ. It doesn't change anything. There's no dissonance. These things coexist. So I thought, therefore, as I said, if I'm telling stories from these places, these things will exist as well, both whether when I'm making new imaginations of them, or you know, it's stuff that already exists from where I'm telling them. So yeah, I think like my storytelling just naturally gravitated in that way as a result of all these influences, and that's really where I started from. I don't think I really had like a jump off point of like, this is why I started writing Afrofutures.
Yeah. All right. I think we're a bit over time, but we're getting great questions. So I'm going to merge some of my questions with one of the questions from the audience. This will probably be our penultimate question, I think. Talking about the use of interludes. So I'll talk about craft in general, right? Womb City, for example, features a story-in-story TV show from the victim of the murder in the scene that you just read, Behind Our Irises, which I have a connection to and I'm very appreciative of. And both The Year of Return and Lost Ark Dreaming feature these interchapter documents from the world that kind of expand on the central narrative. And even in my own collection, Convergence Problems, many of the stories take non-standard formats. Some of them are patent, some of them are told from different perspectives. And the novella I've been mentioning, Ganga, actually has interludes that interweave the Yoruba myth of the hunter and the boa constrictor with this futuristic dystopian story, switching back and forth. So there's structural creativity in our works, right? Maybe that's another theme in a lot of African or Afrocentric futurisms. But linking to the question from the audience, what was the process in choosing those interstitial materials or interweaving chapters or whatever structural creativity, and what were the pros and cons for them? And let's start with Akotowaa.
Okay, so I didn't decide to write a novella. I think actually, The Year of Return was supposed to be a short story, and I don't know what level of delusion made me think that an idea this big could be constrained in a short story. So I basically just wrote until the story was finished, and this is what it's ended up being. Challenges, I think Because I wasn't necessarily thinking about word count, I didn't I didn't face many challenges with the choice of word count in the actual writing. But I think that the toughest part was just like maybe selling it. I wasn't too involved in that process because I have an agent who also happens to be Wole's agent. But I think that selling novellas is just not, I may be wrong. I'm not that much in tune with the publishing industry, but I think that there's just like a difference between like selling novels and short stories, and then selling novellas, which are just like in this weird in between. But as for the non-standard formats, I don't know. I feel like that came with the character. As soon as I had a character who was a journalist, I'm like, well, I don't see how you're going to go through all of this and not write. So, and I also used to blog a lot. I still blog, but not as often. And so the blog formats just seemed very apt for the story that I was telling. Yeah, but I can't say that I went in thinking like, oh, I'm going to use this format and I'm going to be creative over here. I think, they just came the way they came.
Well, I'll answer my own question before I pass it to Suyi, because I think you have something to say about this. For me, kind of interweaving this traditional Yoruba myth with a futuristic, dystopian story of, a city that's supposed to be a refuge from climate change, but actually turns out to be not so great. For me, it kind of came from observing similarities between the idea I had for the story and this old traditional myth. And I think that's one of the things I love about looking at traditional stories and myths and legends, and sometimes even just gossip, is the most powerful ones of them, the ones that have stayed and keep getting repeated over time. They do that because they speak to something very fundamental about the human experience, right? Some core desire that we all have, some core experience that we all go through, something really fundamentally human. And I think looking to those stories and reinterpreting them or thinking about them in our ever-evolving present is a really useful way of trying to understand where we are and where we could potentially be going. And because I was using a futuristic story to comment on our thinking about the present, I thought it would be really good to pull back from this old traditional myth as well, right? Kind of blending past and future to talk about present. But I knew that blend really needed to be almost seamless. So essentially the two characters, the character in this traditional Yoruba myth of the hunter and the boa constrictor, basically it's about a hunter that grows so old and eventually, can no longer hunt. So he gets some magic that allows him transform into a boa constrictor so he can hunt as a different kind of creature. And in the novella Ganga, this girl living in this city finds a way to kind of transfer her consciousness into an artificial body, so to speak, right? And I found the interesting parallels of that desire of trying to be something different from your normal existence as a way of breaking out of the way you currently live, right? The limitations placed on you, I thought was really interesting. So I tried to weave the two character arcs together going forward through time. And I think it's more reinforcing the events that happened in the story, because again, a lot of traditional African storytelling is very event based. So not just thinking about, moving forward, plot must move forward at all costs, which is I find a very Western idea of storytelling, which is good and it works. But I also think reinforcing events, right? Layering on top of themselves can be just as effective, if not more effective. So that was kind of what drove my choice for doing it. If there was any cons, I would say, sometimes people feel like those things maybe break up the main narrative, but I choose to believe that the layering actually reinforces meaning. And I would rather have that than a sense of constant forward momentum. I would rather have a sense of deepening meaning and understanding as you move through the story rather than this relentless forward momentum. So yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking about with those, interstitial pieces weaving this myth and this story together. How about you, Suyi?
I mean, yeah, pretty much saying a lot of what I thought about, right? I was thinking a lot about craft, right? Even this idea, right, of forward momentum is very much a craft concern, because what we think is a good story is a story that has relentless forward momentum that doesn't need to be broken up by anything. And I'm saying all of this and using air quotes because that comes from a dominant perspective of what storytelling is. But not all stories are like that. Many stories employ these patterns of layering, right? And this is one of them. One of the things that it's funny because one of the things people praise about Lost Ark Dreaming is that it is very relentlessly moving forward. But that was the choice, the craft choice I had to make, because I knew for sure that there'd be people who were like, well, these things broke up this other stuff, so I wasn't sure about that. So I felt like I needed to compensate on the other hand of like the actual forward moving narrative was quite quick. But I knew, as you said, I did feel like there needed to be a reinforcement of that meaning, because I wanted to keep pointing out. So there were two things that sort of informed me putting in these found documents. And the first thing is that I wanted it to be clear that even if we're seeing this iteration of the world right now, that's this world, right? 5 towers out in the sea, people living exactly like this. I wanted it to be clear that this is not an isolated event. This is who we are as humans, sort of, kind of thing. This is how we have always done things. So I wanted to sort of demonstrate a spread of events that all point you to something in some time of this people's history, before the floods came, after the floods came, first year of the flood. But I wanted you to see different events that sort of shape how, I want the reader to see how those have shaped who the people in this towers right now are. The second thing was that I also wanted to present the idea that a certain history is being told of this tower, and you, the reader, are receiving a certain history because you're seeing different points in the history and they're being presented to you. But then I wanted that to also start changing after a while, because all this time we're looking at a certain archive, right? The archive of the tower. But as the book progresses, that shifts too. We start receiving excerpts from other archives that are not from the tower. And suddenly you start to go back at the tower's archives and be like, wait, this is telling the same story, but suddenly you're seeing that there's a history that's not quite there. It's missing. It's sort of being left out or being told differently. That allows you to position yourself as a reader in that history, right? So a lot of people, again, readers' response to the book is that the book sort of has a swing somewhere in the middle. But that's the point. The point is for that swing to happen. And then suddenly you're like, oh, wait, what am I reading? And I think the very questioning of what am I reading? What kind of narrative is this? What kind of archive have I been looking to? What do these people believe about their own world? Means you have tapped into another archive of knowledge and understanding of the same world, but from a different point of view. So I think it was both those things. I knew I needed to show that shift. And the only way to show that shift was I didn't want it to just be like, and then the characters in the narrative encountered new knowledge and they were therefore changed. I wanted the reader to experience that change in a way that was like, oh, wow, okay, something is happening here, even if they don't quite know. And I guess that's the effect, right? I didn't want it to be the traditional, and then they became radicalized to make change. I wanted it to be more of that. There's something that happens that is sort of at a base level. It's hard to explain, but a shift has happened. And I wanted it to be both visceral on the reader's side, but also for you to realize why the characters in the story, therefore, make a choice, even when it doesn't seem like the choice is the best choice, but they're compelled to make one because they have received that sort of different knowledge or new way of understanding the same world they've been living in all this time. So yeah, that's what inspired. I had many different excerpts. Some of them didn't make it into the book, but I wrote the excerpts initially for myself to say what happened in this world, and then I started writing it. But then it got to a point where I was like, oh wait, I'm falling into the trap of writing one history for this world. So what are the other histories of the same world that I'm not getting to see. And then I wrote those and I said, okay, now I'm going to layer those in this manner to sort of show the progression and shift away from one to the other. So that was kind of the process. But I will say I started out really writing them for myself. They weren't intended to be, I didn't intend for them to be there. But as I thought more and more about what I wanted to do with the story, and that is really the layering you're talking about, Wole, right? About the layering and repetition of meaning. I realized that in order to do that, this would be a good way to do that. So, yeah.
Oh, great. Tlotlo, what inspired your story TV show in Womb City?
Right, I forgot I was a speaker. I haven't listened to Suyi. I was like, right. Coming to Womb City, it was a combination of many things. I believe at that time I was also writing a couple of stories. So I'll take breaks from like writing Womb City and then I'll write a short story. And I'm like, oh, I've unlocked something that can help me to actually narrate this certain scene. As you've mentioned, Behind Our Irises, which you were the editor of and was published in African Futurism, actually features in Womb City. I think one other thing is that I have been a film fanatic since I was a kid. I did want to be a film director rather than a writer, but for some reason, I realized that it was cheaper. It was cheaper for me to be a writer because I didn't have access to certain resources to be a film director. And so over time, films that I enjoyed, which was either through the cinematography or the score, I would go and search for like screenplays by the directors and even look for like interviews to basically see what the thought process was for the director and actually visualizing this thing. And I was also keen to see how they were able to translate words from like the screenplay into something visual. So sometimes I would look at like the screenplay and then I'll look at like certain scenes. And I think that sort of like helped when I'm writing my work to sort of like translate the images that I have. But also Womb City was sort of like an ode to film. I mean, it initially starts as like a slow burn thriller, and then suddenly you enter this horrifying world. And so we have this character who's sort of a film director, and she basically takes people's nightmares and horrors and turns it into like entertainment. But on the other side of that, she's also navigating this oppressive experience that she's going through with this company that she's working in, and she doesn't have much freedom. And whatever seconds that she has, she tries to document it. And one of the scenes, it's actually almost done like a TV section. And I was really struggling with that part because, like you mentioned, Suyi, like some of these Wole, like you mentioned, some of these experimental narratives can sort of feel like an obstruction to the flow of the narrative. But I always listen to like what the story wants to be and how it wants to be, right? So when I was writing that, I was actually also working on another story, which is Peeling Time. And it's told in the form of like a song. And it's told in almost like the structure of an album. And somehow that was a little bit seamless, but it was also very difficult to write. So I took those skills and tried to add them to Womb City. I mean, you see these characters through technology kind of enter like a sort of like dreamscape, but that dreamscape is actually a TV episode that one of the victims had recorded. And that is almost also like social commentary on some of like the TV shows that exist. I've watched a couple of TV shows that are horror and are basically narrating the lived experiences that Black people have lived through, whether it's in the past or even in the present. And sometimes just watching that, I'm just like, this is entertainment. Like people are actually watching this and people are making money off this. And again, there's going to be another show that's commodified from like our pain. So that section was in a way making commentary on that and how people will be watching what's going on with this victim. And yeah, so the things that I was kind of like battling with that scene is trying to show it as like you're watching a TV show, but like trying to have it in writing, and making it like very immersive and very seamless. So I had like little tags that you would often see when you're watching a TV show, whether it's the play button, where there's like a little description and the genres. And it's like there's a genre to the horror that I'm living. Yeah, so it kind of like breaks that fourth wall in a way, and trying to sort of spread the frequency of that such that it doesn't interrupt the flow, because at some point you'll probably have forgotten that this is actually a TV show within another world in someone's mind. Right. Yeah, I believe that's it.
All right. No, that's great. Yeah, I think one of the real advantages of these things is the ability to add additional immersion either into theme or character or whatever is happening. And, sometimes if you sacrifice a bit of momentum for depth, so be it. It's all right. If they work together, even better. Okay, I think we will take our last question and then we're going to wrap this up because we've gone over time, but people seem to be enjoying it. So, if you guys are here for it, so are we. All right. So good final question from the audience, which is, what conversations would you love your work to inspire on a continental level beyond literary spaces? This is a really good question. And because of that, I'll start with Suyi.
Listen, I don't know that I have an answer to this, okay? Because I have been thinking about it a lot. I've been thinking about what the role of a writer is, right? And I say this specifically because the African writer has a very specific role in African society. And that role tends often to be some sort of change maker or be at the forefront of dissent, of presenting new ways of thinking about the world that they're living in. And even, I've been teaching a lot of courses, right, that sort of charts the trajectory of the African novel as a literary object, okay, and how that comes out of the English novel as a literary object, and how there are roots in the So I've been thinking a lot about the purpose of that object, that literary object, when it first came out, right, as a literary object, and what it had historically been asked to do, and what those burdens therefore are on the artist and the creator. And I've been asking myself, does that still exist, right? Do those burdens still exist? Initially, of course, a lot of the novels that came out were really used to talk about, the everyday condition of the African in a post-colonial society, right? But then a lot of it also depended on what the readership, the publication was for. Like, were you writing to talk about, a newly liberated country for an English readership outside of the country, or were you talking to the people who lived in the country? All of this stuff, right? So I feel like these things are important, and these things sort of have determined historically, and I'm asking myself more and more how much of that still exists, or how much of that I want to be part of a tradition of, versus not doing that. I don't think I've really got settled on an answer. But I guess this means I see myself as someone who therefore is really just writing in a way that forces people to think about possibilities that exist outside of the current existing realities, right? I think that's how I like to think of it. I don't think I'm like a writer who's like making change through my work per se, but I think I like to think that my work is a door, right? You go into the work, you read something, it's exciting, excellent, whatever, right? But you come out the other end and a new door has manifested in your mind. Now you can try to go through it. You can say, listen, I want to think about the fact that climate change is actually a real and present concern for me, the average Lagos resident, which you probably hadn't been thinking about as much, or it's been in the periphery. But you were just going to work every day, but then you read Lost Ark Dreaming and suddenly it's ever present. And I'll say this because the Nigerian publisher of this book picked up this book because, according to him, he was trying to buy some land in a new development area in Lagos. And then he read Lost Ark Dreaming and he canceled the deal because because he thought after reading this book that he hadn't been thinking enough about the future of that piece of land. And immediately after reading this book, he thought about the future, and he was like, absolutely, I absolutely can't buy that. It doesn't make any sense just thinking about it. But I like to think that's what my work is doing. Like, it's forcing you to realize that there's a door you haven't opened, and you should probably go through it and see what's on the other side. And I think that's what I think that's what I'm hoping the work does, and then that's what I'm hoping starts conversations. That is, someone goes through that door, another person goes through that door, and maybe somewhere in the grand, somewhere in the world they meet, and then they talk about this thing, and then that's how I foresee any sort of conversation starting, or where those conversations would or how they would happen, right? It could be climate change, it could be different ways of thinking about history, it could be ways of thinking about belief, spirituality, technology, whatever manner this story takes. The story Rigoland you were talking about, Wole, is really set in the Niger Delta, which is part of where I grew up. My father is from there, so I knew about like oil and how that has affected like the environmental. I wasn't even thinking about climate change or environmental factors, but I was thinking about the very lived experience. But I'm pretty much sure anyone who reads that will immediately start thinking about how oil exploration in the Niger Delta of Nigeria will start thinking about it differently, I think. That's kind of like that's really what I'm hoping my work does. And I think that's the impact I'm hoping to see, that somewhere in the wild, two people who have gone through those doors that the work opened in them meet. And then maybe they start something. I don't know. But yeah, that's what I'm thinking, I'm hoping for. Yeah.
That is a great answer. And I was just thinking the entire time, your secret agenda is to depress the real estate markets in Lagos, right? This is your real objective. You can confess. This is the safe space.
I mean, if that happened, that would be great. Honestly, I think the real estate market in Lagos sucks. But
I'm kidding. That was great. How about you, Akotowaa? What conversations are you hoping to inspire?
I think for this particular book, I can give several. So for one, I feel like conversations about the transatlantic slave trade, for very, very legitimate reasons, often center other places other than where the captivity originated. And first of all, I'm hoping that this book, written by somebody who is still based on the continent, can I mean, I know a lot of Ghanaians who are just like, I don't like reading about slavery. And for some people, the reason is that it just brings up a lot of guilt. Because it's something that we don't, as people whose ancestors, depending on like which ethnic group and where your family comes from, whose ancestors very likely benefited from this thing. You don't want to be reminded of it. Like, there are things happening to this day that nobody wants to speak publicly about because they tie very directly to the benefits that certain families derived from aiding the slave traders and so on and so forth. So I really want this to be like a conversation starter on like, okay, what is the role that Ghanaians actually played or Africans actually played, right? How does this, I mean, the catalyzing events of this story start on the Ghanaian coast. And I feel like that was a very important move for me. Like most of the action and discovery and like the people who are disseminating the information that helps the rest of the world understand what's going on are based in Ghana. And I mean, Ghana is the site of many popular tourist destinations that are, sites of horror. And I remember as a child, my school took me on a excursion, a field trip to some of these castles. And not once ever was it like mentioned to me that Africans had any role whatsoever in this thing. And I feel like that is a conception that many people have carried into adulthood. And I feel like reading this book can help people interrogate those sorts of things more. Secondly, I think that a lot of the documentation on enslaved people in the Americas has focused on like their lived experiences there. And I feel like I haven't seen as many explorations of what it must have felt like to be put on the water, just to be put on the water. So I did my major in undergrad was Africana Studies, and I took a history course because I concentrated in history. So I took a history course where I read this book called Saltwater Slavery, and it explored from like an Akan perspective. Akan is an ethnic group in Ghana, for people who don't know. From an Akan perspective, like what it would have meant on a cosmological level to die and not be buried. Like I had never thought about this. Like your entire worldview is based on this cycle that involves you communing with your ancestors in ancestral land when you're dead, and so on and so forth. And like just the idea that Africans were dying on boats, on ships, and not being, oh my gosh. Okay.
Sorry, he just woke up, so he just walked in here.
I'm out here
Special
talking
guest.
about this deep subjects, and here's this adorable child. But you know, so like I'd never thought like, what does this feel like to just have everything that you believe like stripped away? Like, what does it mean that your entire afterlife is just not happening anymore? Like, I had never considered what that meant from the perspective of an African. And I feel like I really want this book to be able to start opening like up conversations about like what it really must have felt like. Because I feel like that lack of empathy is what creates the apathy. And so if you really get in there, if you really try to get into the head of a character who may have gone through that, I feel like the reverence that we need to hold for these people and for the histories that we have experienced, or our ancestors have experienced, or our land has experienced, we can hold those things in higher honor. So yeah.
No, thank you. That's a great conversation to start. Tlotlo, what conversations do you want Womb City to inspire?
Well, I think I agree with Akotowaa there. I kind of have like a similar answer. I was actually working on a story where I was trying to do research around the 1800s, 1900s in like Southern Africa. But I was really trying to find stuff written by Black people in Southern Africa, or particularly even from Black female voices. And anything that requires excavating our history, our stories, variances like within our clans, it's very inaccessible as compared to like different parts in Africa. You can find so many authors from different parts in Africa who have written about materials of like the country, both in mainstream publishing, etc. And so I think for me, what's important for me is that actually having a lot of authors from Southern Africa, whether it's in publishing or academia, who are able to actually retain some of these stories that is very difficult for us to easily have easier access to. So I see a lot of like erasure, some of it being colonial erasure. I also see a lot of like loss and loss of like connection to our language, looking at the things that were being taught back in my home country. You know, we're learning about different histories. I actually was in one secondary school where we were actually not being taught our own language, yet we were learning like English and French. And so I lost a lot of stuff through that. So one of the things that is very important to me is that, you know, some of these stories, whether it's myths, whether it's how we lived back in the past, are mostly within our elders. Yes, colonization is a hell of a drug. So most of our stories are like with our elders, and then when they pass away, we've lost that. And in a way, we've sort of like lost who we are. We've lost like our identity. Even if we look at how like Westernization has penetrated like our city, the rituals that we used to have, the way that we used to dress, the variances that we had within each tribe back at home. That has been lost. And so I would literally have to dig, and I would have to like dig through the internet or get some of this information from some people who I'd be lucky that I came across. And I feel that if we had a lot of people in the space who are writing about these things, we'll be able to retain a part of like our culture and history. And I mean, like the same thing that Akotowaa says, with some people not wanting to tackle some of these things given the issue. We have a similar thing back at home, in that within our culture, there's some things that should not be spoken about, should just be hidden or be kept secret. It's almost like taboo to talk about certain things. And then if you talk about certain things, you're like a problem person, and you're kind of like fighting certain structures within culture. And so you lose that. And I feel like you also lose a part of your identity. So I had also come up, through my research, I actually came across a Black female scholar. I think she was from Swaziland sometime in the mid-1900s. And she was feminist in a way. She was one of few Black women who went through, I think she got a PhD or something, and she was trying to publish some of like her material within academia, but she was facing barriers from dealing with misogyny. And even around that time, she was kind of like fighting what the work that white scholars were doing. So most of the things that I'd find written during that time are written by white scholars or white people. And I mean, yes, they're still giving us access to information, but I feel because they're also not from that culture, there's something that you're losing that they may not know that a native knows, right? So there's a loss, and there's like some distorting that's being done on the information that they choose to share. And I think it was a very sad thing to read, because on her deathbed, she was basically begging publishers to publish her work, to at least have one of her books come out before she died. And of course, she ended up passing away before actually seeing her book materializing. And I think she was also participating politically within the landscape of that time. And I think maybe the country was gaining independence. And so she died even before that, to actually see the fruitfulness of her work. And then what happened is that her work sat in white scholars' like offices. I think one white scholar refused to get it published because she felt they had this conflict through her lifetime. And so she just sat on it. And I think it's within, when the white scholar passed away, it's within her library now in some place in the US. And I think her story only got to be published, the Black female scholar, through another white scholar. And and even the white scholar did talk about how not any normal person can have access to that. And she did speak of her privilege. So for me, I just really wish we had more people from Southern Africa, but I understand because there are like also so many barriers. And it's just weird that these things that were existing in the 1900s are also continuing now, right?
Yeah. Thank you. All right, I guess I'll answer the question and then round up this panel. We've gone way over time, but hopefully it's been good. What conversations do I hope my work will inspire? Specifically, convergence problems. I think it illustrates one of the main things I've been trying to do with a lot of my short fiction recently, which is to illustrate the complexity and modern applicability of African thought. Because I think, as I kind of made, jokingly in the chat, colonization is a hell of a drug. And the effects have lasted long. And I think even in the minds of other Africans as well, right? It's very common to find Africans, commenting on our own traditional belief systems and religions as pagan, as primitive, as underdeveloped. I've been in meeting rooms where we're talking about science fiction and someone says, oh, that doesn't look futuristic. It looks too African. And when you see the word choice, you immediately know that the mind has been colonized, right? African means backward looking. Futuristic is forward looking. And these are other Africans speaking. So a lot of what I try to do with my work, especially because I am an engineer and I'm very much familiar with classic science fiction traditions. I grew up reading Asimov's and Clark and Arthur C. Clarke and, Larry Niven and all these kinds of things. Like my dad was a big science fiction fan. So I'm very aware of that, but I'm also very aware of the biases and the blind spots in all of that as well. And I'm hoping that my work inspires conversations around bending some of those thoughts. The future is important in Africa, and it's not a separate thing, right? It's not like, oh, we throw out all Western thinking and replace with traditional African thinking, but it's more about taking the best of every possible human philosophy and using that as a kind of guide to think about the future. And that's something that comes up with a lot of my stories where I infuse the so-called, futuristic setting with considerations founded in African traditional beliefs, African philosophies, as an alternate way of remedying current concerns and current problems about where we're going. So that's something I hope to do, is just inspire those conversations about how can we take elements of African traditional beliefs, cultures, philosophies, sciences, all of these things, and use them in our future thinking. And as long as those conversations happen, then I'm happy. So yeah, that brings us to the end of this panel. It has been really, really fun. Thank you all. Akotowaa, Suyi, Tlotlo for joining, for sharing your thoughts. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you very much to Tordotcom for hosting us. Thank you, Tsamaase, for being here. I'll just give everyone a quick reminder that you can get signed copies of all our books from the sister sci-fi bookstore. They have book plates, they have the books. You can get them from bookstores around the world as well. Wherever good books are sold, you can get them online. I believe we all have audiobooks or ebooks at the very least. So yeah, please pick them up, read them, enjoy them, comment, share, like, subscribe. I have nothing for you to subscribe to, but subscribe anyway. And yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And have a good evening or afternoon or day, wherever you are.